Welcome, everybody. This is Paul Keeley at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We're just going to give it another minute or so for people to log in, and then we'll get started. Thanks for joining us today. Once again, thank you for joining us today. We will give it another 30 seconds or so to give people a moment to log in to the call, and then we'll get started. Thanks for joining us. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to Nlhc's National House campaign call for universal, stable, and affordable housing. During this call, we will discuss the FY 2022 spending bill that was just passed and its implications for affordable housing, as well as the importance of protecting critical housing investments in any budget reconciliation bill. We'll have some guests on from Eviction Lab who will share some conclusions from a preliminary analysis of eviction filing patterns in 2021. We'll have some friends from Apt Associates to summarize findings from the 2021 annual Homelessness Assessment Report, the AHAR, to Congress. We'll have Rebecca Ye from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and Claudia Aiken from the Housing Initiative at Penn to discuss a joint report that we just issued on emergency rental assistance lessons learned for establishing permanent ERA programs. We'll also discuss new Treasury data on ERA spending, receive updates from the field, and more. So again, thank you for joining us. I do have a couple of notes that I want to share with you. First, there will be no HoUSed campaign call next week, March 21st, because next week is Nlhc's Virtual Housing Policy Forum, taking place on March 22nd and 23rd, featuring HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge and conversations with Senator Sherrod Brown and Representatives Maxine Waters, Cori Bush, Pramila Jayapal, and Richie Torres, as well as an array of sessions on racial equity and housing justice, achieving renter protections, building the multi-sector affordable housing movement, an insiders discussion on the state of play on Capitol Hill, and much more. Please join us for the forum. I'll go ahead and put a link into the chat right now. I have to find it first. Here we go. I got to make sure I send it to all attendees. So the link is there. And we really do hope that all of you will be able to join us for the policy forum. I also wanted to share that the day after the virtual forum, March 24th, is Virtual Capitol Hill Day. We encourage you to participate on that. And Nlhc is going to be hosting a webinar this Wednesday, March 16th at 12 p.m., so noon Eastern time, on Nlhc policy priorities for your advocacy asks with members of Congress. And I will put, again, the link to the forum and to that webinar into the chat. So just give me a second. We encourage you all to join us for that as well. So that webinar will be coming up on Wednesday. So please join us for that. Let's see, there are a couple of other announcements that I wanted to make. In April, we will be moving these calls, instead of to weekly, we're going to be doing them bi-weekly, so every other Monday. And what we'll be doing is rotating them with webinars on Our Homes, Our Votes, nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement. So one Monday will be the HoUSed campaign call. The next day will be, or the next Monday will be the Our Homes, Our Votes call or webinar and so forth. So we'll be rotating them. So every Monday there will be something. One week it'll be the HoUSed campaign call. The next week it'll be the Our Homes, Our Votes webinars. These webinars will cover everything nonprofits need to know about how to engage low-income people in voting and how to get candidates to address affordable housing in their campaigns. So our next HoUSed call will be March 28th. And our first Our Homes, Our Votes webinar will be April 4th. So everyone on this call is welcome to both. You'll be hearing much more about them. We'll be sending out reminders to you to participate. We hope you participate in both of those. So I wanted to give those two announcements before we got started with today's call. And I do want to remind everybody to please, if you have questions for any of our speakers or panelists, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen there. You can certainly use the chat function, but more, use that for communicating with other participants about various things. We'll be putting links into the chat. But if you have questions for the panelists or speakers, I do encourage you to put them into the Q&A box. We'll get to as many questions as we can. Sometimes we can't get to all of them live, but if our panelists can stick around, maybe they'll be able to answer some of your questions that way as well. So I just wanted to urge you to do that. We will also be sending out all of the slides from this call and a recording of the call to all participants after the call. So sometimes we get that question in the Q&A or in the chat. Will we be able to get the slides from this? And the answer is yes, you'll be receiving the slides after the call. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And our first presenter is Kim Johnson from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, who's going to talk a little bit about the FY22 spending bill that just passed and the importance of any budget reconciliation bill having key and bold affordable housing investments. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim. Kim?
Thanks so much, Paul, and hi, everyone. So like Paul said, I'm Kim Johnson. I'm a senior policy analyst here at Nlhc, and I am filling in for Sarah today to bring the latest intel from Capitol Hill. So we have some pretty big news from the last week. On Friday, President Biden signed a federal spending bill for fiscal year 2022, which will keep the federal government running until the new fiscal year begins on October 1st. The new spending bill provides HUD programs with about $2.5 billion in increased funding over FY 2021 enacted levels, plus $1.5 billion in earmarked spending, which brings the total for HUD funding to roughly $53.7 billion. This is also the first time in the last decade that appropriators were not limited by the Budget Control Act, which established strict spending limits on both defense and non-defense programs. The funding increase is thanks in large part to the hard work of advocates like the people on this call who weighed in with their members of Congress on the importance of increased funding for HUD programs. So thank you all so much for your advocacy. We are also so grateful for the work of our affordable housing champions in Congress, including Senators Brian Schatz and Susan Collins and Representatives David Price and Mario Diaz-Balart, who are the chairs and ranking members of the Senate and House THUD appropriations subcommittees. Rather than providing a rundown of the housing components of the bill, I am going to give just a couple highlights. And for more information, you can check out our detailed analysis of the bill, a link to which Elena will be dropping in the chat. So the spending bill provides moderate funding increases to nearly all HUD programs compared to FY 2021, including enough funding to renew all existing housing choice voucher and project-based rental assistance contracts. The bill also provides an additional $200 million to expand housing vouchers to an additional 25,000 households, including individuals at risk of or experiencing homelessness, veterans, and survivors of violence in need of safe housing. Homeless assistance grants and grants for tribal nations, including the Tribal Block Grant and Competitive Fund, also received boosted funding. The final spending bill was also accompanied by some congressional directives to provide further details and instructions to HUD and other federal agencies. Those directives cover a range of issues, including COVID-19 relief and Treasury's Emergency Rental Assistance Program, disaster recovery efforts at HUD and FEMA, and housing on tribal lands. Lawmakers also attached to the FY22 spending bill a reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, which supports comprehensive responses and services for survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking. Among other vital provisions, the bill enhances housing protections for survivors of violence by improving the compliance review process and federally assisted housing, ensuring survivors are not denied access to or evicted from housing because of the violence committed against them, and strengthening privacy protections. The bill also amends the federal definition of homelessness to include the experiences of survivors escaping or attempting to escape violence. A provision to allocate additional COVID relief money was ultimately dropped from the bill. That roughly $15 billion in additional fund for COVID vaccines and therapies hit resistance from House Democrats, who criticized the plan for proposing to claw back about $7 billion in state fiscal relief funds to help pay for the COVID supplemental. So that's money that was allocated to states through the American Rescue Plan Act that they were proposing, basically clawing back to help pay for that new COVID funding that was ultimately dropped. With the FY22 bill signed, lawmakers will have until October 1st, 2022 to enact another budget bill for fiscal year 2023. So we're expecting the president to release his budget request for FY23 sometime this week or next week, which will mark the official kickoff of the FY23 appropriation season. Senators Patrick Leahy and Richard Shelby, who are the chair and ranking member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, are already planning on convening House and Senate appropriations leaders to discuss the FY23 spending bill in order to avoid another massive delay like we saw this year. So it is not too early to start weighing in with your members of Congress on the need for increased funding for affordable housing programs in the FY23 appropriations bill. Specifically, we're asking advocates to urge their members of Congress to provide HUD and USDA affordable housing programs with the highest possible funding in FY 2023. So that includes 1, an expansion of housing vouchers to an additional 200,000 households, 2, significant funding to preserve and operate public housing, 3, robust resources to address homelessness through homeless assistance grants, 4, additional funding for the competitive tribal housing program targeted to tribes with the greatest needs, and 5, at least $100 million for legal assistance to prevent evictions, among other key priorities. We actually have an annual 302B letter that federal, state, and local organizations are all encouraged to join. The letter urges congressional appropriators to provide the highest possible funding for affordable housing and community development programs for the coming fiscal year. You all can join the letter at the link that Elena will be dropping in the chat. It's also important to keep in mind that while the FY22 spending bill provides meaningful increases for vital HUD and USDA programs, far more resources are needed to address the nation's growing and significant affordable housing and homelessness crisis. We need significant targeted investments in affordable housing in order to address the skyrocketing cost of rent, which is a critical driver of inflation. And while the Build Back Better Act may no longer be in the picture, as Congress begins to reimagine what the forthcoming reconciliation package might look like, it is vital that we keep pushing to ensure that targeted investments in deeply affordable housing remain in any new reconciliation bill, including $25 billion to expand housing vouchers to an estimated 300,000 households, $65 billion to make critically needed repairs to public housing, and $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund to construct, preserve, and operate an estimated 150,000 new units of affordable and accessible housing. So that is about it for my updates. I'm happy to answer any questions. And in the meantime, I will turn it back over to you, Paul.
Great, Kim. Well, that was so thorough. There are no open questions in our Q&A box. So I think we're good to go. If anybody has any questions that they think of later, Kim will be around, so she'll be able to type her answers back to you. But thank you very much for that overview, Kim. All right. So now we're going to move on to the conclusions from a preliminary analysis of eviction filing patterns in 2021 with our partners at Eviction Lab, Ann Kat Alexander, Emily Lemmerman, and Joe Fish. And I will turn it over to you all. Take it away.
Hi, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. Next slide, please. Title slide. We're here today to talk about the latest findings from our eviction tracking system. We recently put out a preliminary analysis of filings in 2021. Next slide. For those who are not familiar, this is a data set that covers 31 cities and 6 states and is updated every week. This covers how many eviction filings are filed in those places. This covers about 25% of all renters. And we compare the filing volume that we see each week to a historical average, which is the number of filings in that time period in one or more typical years. So it allows us to make comparisons between filings during the pandemic and filings during typical years prior to the pandemic. Next slide. The research that we're about to speak about is one in a series of related posts. This is something of a sequel to our US eviction filing patterns in 2020. You can read the earlier iterations on our website. Next slide. So very briefly, we estimate that at least 1.36 million eviction cases were averted nationwide during the year 2021. This is a conservative estimate. It's found by projecting how many eviction cases we would have expected to see in a typical year, and then subtracting the number that we actually saw. This is conservative because we would have actually expected, in the absence of any kind of protections or assistance, for eviction filing cases to go up in 2021 because so many more families were struggling financially. And then, what we actually saw was that cases were down compared to typical years. We estimate that across 2020 and 2021, more than 3 million eviction cases have been averted. The greatest reductions in eviction case filings were seen in low-income and majority Black neighborhoods, and reductions in eviction filing volume were not even across the country or across our ETS sites specifically. They varied depending on where you were, your jurisdiction, over the course of the year and based on neighborhood demographics. Important to note, this is not a causal analysis, so we are not able to say based on this analysis that a particular program caused a certain number of evictions not to be filed. And also, this analysis includes only formal eviction filings in the court system, so it does not take into account informal forms of displacement like a landlord not renewing a lease. Next slide. As a refresher for the policy context, over the course of 2021, some eviction prevention policies expired, such as state and federal eviction moratoria, but others ramped up over the course of 2021. Emergency rental assistance came online, especially accelerating through the summer and into the winter, and the child tax credit started in the second half of the year. Next slide.
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm a research specialist at the Eviction Lab. So this graph shows the historical volume, the observed filing volume relative to historical filing patterns in each month. So for instance, if March was about 55%, that means we saw about 55% of historical volume across all of the sites that we monitor. So what we see in this graph is that filings have been down over the course of the year relative to historic numbers, but they've begun to trickle up, particularly after the expiration of the CDC moratorium. And this is something that's continued into the early months of 2022. So we're going to be monitoring this really closely, and we're, like everyone, very interested and concerned about filing patterns returning to their incredibly high historical norms. Next slide. So while there has been this overall reduction in filing volume relative to historical averages, where you lived has mattered a lot for how big of a reduction there's been. On one hand, places like New York and Austin have been able to sustain filing volumes of less than a quarter than what they normally would have had. And then in places like Las Vegas, there's actually been more eviction filings than the historical averages. You can look at New York and Austin, they had very persistent and very thorough local moratoria. But I think for analyses about why an individual location had more or less of a filing reduction relative to other places, it would be a better idea to turn to someone who's on the ground, who has just a better sense of local conditions than we do. Next slide. So one of the things that we've also been monitoring, in addition to overall reductions in filing volume, has been how this has played out for different demographic groups. So the bottom panel of this graph shows the racial demographic breakdown of US renters, and then the top panel shows the racial breakdown of defendants in eviction filings. So what we see is that Black renters in particular are disproportionately represented as a percent of eviction filings. ANCAP mentioned in the beginning of her slides that tracts in majority Black neighborhoods saw disproportionate reductions in filings. But this is saying that even despite that, Black renters are overrepresented as a share of their filings. And this is something that's been consistent with all our previous historical research in years prior to the pandemic. Next slide.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily. I'm a research specialist at the Eviction Lab as well. So as you can see from the last slide, while Black tenants continued to be overrepresented as a total share of renters throughout 2021, we saw the greatest reductions in majority Black neighborhoods, with nearly 28% of the total reduction in eviction filings happening in majority Black neighborhoods, which made up about 11% of our sample. Similarly, white Latino tracts only accounted for 9.8% of our sample, but they made up 24% of the total reduction in eviction filings. Next slide. Kind of jumping off of that a little bit, our analysis also finds that in terms of the number of filings reduced, the greatest reduction in eviction filings relative to the average number of historical filings were among those households living in tracts where the median income was below $50,000. And that only made up 35% of the tracts that we were observing. And yet the reduction in filings, over a 240,000 filing reduction where we were able to observe median income, was 57.3% of the filings reduced. And so that's a reduction by over half of the evictions compared to the historical average, with a median income below 50,000. And it potentially suggests that the targeting of ERAP was able to lessen inequities in a similar way to how the previous slide kind of suggests that the places where the policies that were implemented throughout this year were able to most help renters were in places that were majority Black and majority Latino tenants, and tenants making less than $50,000 a year. Next slide.
So as some closing thoughts, we see from these results that the policies and programs that were in place during the pandemic were able to reduce eviction filings in the neighborhoods where historically people have had the most need for that kind of assistance. So that's really good. Moving forward, we'd love to conduct some causal analyses to determine what policies helped the most and why the same policies might have had great reductions in eviction filings in some areas, but fewer reductions in other areas. At this point, it's also time to start thinking about how we can transition from emergency policies to long-term structural changes. You know, there is no reason at this point why we should go back to normal eviction filing volume, particularly when we see that some places have been able to maintain much lower eviction filing rates overall. So let's think about how we can continue to keep eviction filings lower. And it's also important to keep in mind that in 2022, cases are rising across the country and some areas are returning to normal filing volume. So, you know, time is of the essence on thinking about how to make these changes longer lasting. Next slide. We have lots of analysis coming out all the time, both from ETS and other research on our website. Link is there. That's some of our most recent pieces. Next slide. And that is it for us. Happy to answer any questions. Those are our funders.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anne, Emily, and Joe, for this information. What great analysis. The two things that really strike me. One is how impressive your breakdown along the racial disparities and the benefits, frankly, also that accrued from all of the work that has been done. And then that kind of leads me to my second point, which is I just want to say, you know, kudos to everyone on this call and all of your partners who work so hard. Number one, to get the eviction moratoriums in place and then extended and to get all that emergency rental assistance passed, and then to influence how that emergency rental assistance was getting out to people on the ground. Because this data, you know, that shows over 3 million eviction cases were averted during the pandemic is so much because of all the work that you did. So I just want to say kudos to all of the people on this call who have been such fierce advocates all along. And again, to our partners at Eviction Lab for this phenomenal research. So a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer them, but I will share them with you in case you have any thoughts about them. One is do you have any information about seniors and disabled adults and their evictions? Is there any data that breaks it down by seniors and people with disabilities?
So we do not have information about age or disability status. We actually don't have any demographic information about tenants. We're able to impute race and gender based on names and addresses, but we are not able to impute for age and disability. So that's one of the things that we're interested in, finding other sources of data to combine with ours so that we can conduct analysis on those specific groups, because we know that that's really important.
There's kind of a related question is, do you have any comparison between 2021 defendant demographics, i.e. race, gender, imputing, and 2019?
Do one of the research specialists have an update on this for 2019?
Yeah, so currently we use the American Community Survey, ACS data from the Census Bureau as our way of understanding renter demographics. And since that data is most recently released in 2019, we are still using that as sort of a baseline, assuming that tracts have mostly stayed the same in terms of the number of renter households in that tract with each racial composition.
Great, thank you. So a very quick question. I think I know the answer to this, but I'll let you guys respond to it. How are the cities selected for your work? And they ask, is it based on the number of evictions and related to the city's population?
Yeah, so we started with a list of, I think it was the top 200 cities by population, and then we look at availability of data. So we need to be able to reliably collect the data every week, and there are not a ton of places where that's possible. And so what we have right now are the places where that was possible to set up that infrastructure to be able to report that information. If you live in a place where you think that it is possible and you're not on our list, or you work for a local government and you know that you can get the information to us, definitely reach out at info@evictionlab.org, and we're happy to talk to you to see whether we can get your area on the ETS.
Very good. And there's a question here. Do you have any advice, best practice recommendations about how to gather information on informal evictions and displacement?
This is super tricky. You know, the best data that we have on informal eviction rates is from Matt Desmond's Mars survey. And this was a very in-depth survey where went door to door talking to people in Milwaukee, very thorough, lots of survey items. And so, since then, we haven't been able to find a source that we could use for information later on. It's one of those that's really tricky to get our hands on, and we're still thinking about creative ways that we could get that information.
All right, very good. There are a few more questions in the Q&A box. If you have a chance, just take a look at those. But due to time, I think we're going to move on in our agenda. I just again want to thank Joe, Emily, and Ann for joining us on this call, sharing this great information, and for all of your work. We'll be inviting you back in the future. I can assure you that. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we will move on now to our friends at Apt Associates, Megan Henry, Tanya DeSosa, and Anna Robinson, who will be talking about findings from HUD's 2021 Annual Homelessness Assessment Report. So I will turn it over to Megan, Tanya, and Anna.
Thank you very much. And I do want to say to the Princeton folks, your slides were so pretty that I'm feeling a little self-conscious now, but we'll move on. Next slide. So I'm Megan Henry. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the AHAR director at Apt Associates. My colleagues here are Anna and Tanya, although I don't think they have their cameras on. It's okay. They're going to help answer questions. Next slide. So many of you probably know, but for those of you who do not know, the annual Homelessness Assessment Report is a two-part report that is prepared for Congress every year. It's prepared by Apt, and it really is the results of the efforts of about 400 communities across the country who collect and submit data on homelessness each year. There are 3 data sources that go into the production of the report. There is point-in-time data, housing inventory data, and then longitudinal systems analysis data. The presentation today will be focused on the point-in-time and housing inventory data. Next slide. So what is the point-in-time count? Essentially, the point-in-time count is a census of all people who are experiencing homelessness on a single night, most often during the last 10 days of January. Again, the COCs, which are an administrative jurisdiction that receives HUD funding for homeless programs, are responsible for conducting their counts, and these can be cities, counties, groups of counties, or states. The PIT is conducted every year. The sheltered PIT is conducted every year, and then the unsheltered count historically has only been conducted every other year in odd-numbered years. But before the pandemic, about 85% of communities were conducting unsheltered counts annually. In 2021, because of COVID-19, HUD gave essentially a broad waiver, and so about half of communities didn't conduct an unsheltered count at all. Next slide. So the housing inventory count, where the PIT is a census of people, the HIC is essentially a census of beds available for people experiencing homelessness. The HIC captures both those beds for people currently experiencing homelessness and beds for formerly homeless people who are in rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, or other permanent housing options like Section 8 or public housing units that are set aside specifically for people experiencing homelessness. Again, COCs conduct the HIC, and they're required to report those data on the same for the same night as they conduct their PIT count, and it is conducted every year. Next slide. So the 2021 AHAR is very different from prior year reports. First of all, because only about half of communities across the country conducted an unsheltered count, it focuses primarily on sheltered homelessness at a point in time. And so all of the chapters on all of the different populations that are ordinarily included in the report, we're only really reporting out on the sheltered populations or in 2021. However, it does include, because of the data that we did collect, it does include additional information on inventory and occupancy rates to help contextualize some of the data that we were seeing. And also it provides a bit more context in terms of what we pulled from the data. Part of our data quality review process is communicating back and forth with communities for about 6 weeks around issues related to their data, why certain changes existed or happened. And through that process, we learned a lot about what happens on the ground in communities. And so we include some of that information in an appendix in the report this year. And that appendix also includes information on the half of communities that did conduct an unsheltered count to get a sense for at least what was happening in those communities. Next slide. So to just set the stage a little bit, here is a map of the continuums of care across the country. As you can see, they take a variety of forms. Those in gray are those that conducted no unsheltered count at all in January of 2021. And so as you know, almost all of the West Coast didn't conduct an unsheltered count. The light blue communities are those that just did a head count, so there's no housing household characteristics or demographics associated with people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And those in dark blue are communities that conducted full unsheltered counts last year. Okay, next slide. So here are the top line estimates for the sheltered population in 2021. So in January of 2021, there were over 326,000 people occupying sheltered programs or staying in shelter programs on a single night. This represents an 8% decline in the sheltered homeless population over 1 year. This is really driven by the declines in people experiencing homelessness in families with children. Sheltered individuals, that is people in adult-only households without a child present, declined by about 2%. And then youth by unaccompanied youth by about 9% and veterans by about 10%. Now, unaccompanied youth and sheltered veterans had been experiencing a slight declines in recent years, but these are bigger dips than we had been seeing before. Now, one outlier here is the number of people in shelters with chronic patterns of homelessness. That number increased by 20% this past year, or between 2020 and 2021. While that particular population had been slowly rising in the last few years, this is an incredible jump. It's a much different sort of increase than we had been seeing. Next slide. So, sort of counterintuitively, the overall capacity reported by communities to serve people currently experiencing homelessness actually increased slightly between 2020 and 2021. For emergency shelter, it increased by 6% overall. But here are the 3 different types of beds that communities report. Facility-based beds is a vast majority of the type of capacity that communities have. And those are essentially the congregate setting type beds. The sort of, when you think about an emergency shelter, this is what you think about. And that sort of stayed the same or declined just slightly. Where we saw increases are in the number of voucher beds. So those include beds that are in hotels and motels, which were relied upon by a lot of communities during the pandemic. And that number increased by about 134%. Next slide. So while that overall capacity increased, the occupancy rate, so the number of beds actually occupied by a person on the night of the count, actually did decline. So as you can see across the 3 types of programs that are considered part of the sheltered system, all of the rates of occupancy declined between 2020 and 2021. Next slide. So why did sheltered homelessness decline? This actually connects with the previous presentation very well. So first of all, communities often had to reduce their capacity by often 2/3 to sort of meet the requirements around physical distancing. Communities also reported that there was just a greater hesitancy in coming into shelter during the pandemic. The additional resources around for rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing allowed communities to move people from shelter into housing much quicker and at a greater sort of a much more people in that time. And generally just a stemmed inflow into the homeless system due to a lot of the things that sort of went to build up the social safety net. Communities widely reported eviction moratoria, so both the federal moratorium, but also state level moratoria really played a critical role in reducing the number of people coming into homelessness. CARES Act funding and then other homelessness prevention and shelter diversion efforts played a pretty critical role. Next slide. So some other things that we found during the report, and this is by no means an exhaustive review of everything we found, but it's sort of just a sampling. Communities that did conduct unsheltered counts, so that those sort of 210, half of communities in the country, experienced pretty much no change in the number of unsheltered people in their communities, but they're not a representative sample of communities. If you recall that map, almost the entire West Coast wouldn't be represented. And in fact, those 210 communities only accounted for 22% of the entire unsheltered population in 2020. So while it's sort of interesting to understand, it's not really representative. We can't really use it for much. Overall, and this is sort of the key takeaway in my mind, overall the data do suggest and continues to suggest in other sort of AHAR analyses that there is an increased vulnerability in those who remain sheltered, like that increase in the number of people with chronic patterns of homelessness. But also what's not what I did not include on the slides was there was an increase in transgender and gender not conforming unaccompanied youth and individuals. There was also an increase in Native American unaccompanied youth and individuals. And the number of permanent supportive housing beds that are set aside for people with chronic patterns of homelessness declined for the first time since data collection began. And these are just a few of the sort of data suggestions that sort of point to an increased vulnerability of the population. Next slide, I think that's it though. Okay, and I have some time for questions if there are any.
Great, thank you very much, Megan. That was really informative. There's a question here. You kind of addressed, I think, the question about why the trends in homelessness increasing and decreasing in a number of areas. One individual asked, what was the impact? I'll sort of rephrase it a little bit. What was the impact, do you think, or are you surmising that was related to cities opening hotels as shelters during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think we did see that was represented in the data in terms of the use of shelter. What we don't have is, so essentially HUD was really sort of trying to provide communities with a lot of flexibility during this time, because as you all recall, there was this influx of COVID-related funding, which required a lot of reporting. And then they had to conduct their PIC counts and their HIT counts and report all these data. So HUD gave a lot of flexibility to communities to not change the type of bed. So a lot of the beds that might have been in hotels and motels were still reported under their facility-based inventory. So I feel like next year, or the data that are being sort of reported starting today, actually we opened, will tell a clearer story about how communities have shifted their inventory. But unfortunately, we don't have a clear view into it as of now.
Great, thank you. Deb Techmeyer, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, asked why the drop in permanent supportive housing usage. Do you have any information on that? Or... Well,
yeah, over the last few years, there has been, permanent supportive housing was historically really targeted to the chronically homeless population. And recently there's been a lot of funding for families in permanent supportive housing. So the number of permanent supportive housing beds, I believe, did increase slightly, but it's just the number that were targeted to this population, this vulnerable population, declined. And it really could have been just about community level need, but that doesn't seem totally supported in the data because the number of sheltered chronically homeless individuals has increased. So it's really unclear. I wish we had more information around that.
All right, fantastic, Megan. Thank you so much, and to your colleagues for joining us for this presentation. There may be some other questions that come into you. If you can keep an eye out on the chat and the Q&A, if you have time for that, that'd be great. But we really appreciate you coming on and sharing this important information with us. Thank you so much. Okay, we will now move on to a new report. And I'll turn it over to our own Rebecca Yeh, Senior Research Analyst at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, along with our partner at Housing Initiative at Penn, Claudia Aiken, to talk about that report on lessons from ERA programs for permanent ERA programs. So I will turn it over now to Rebecca.
I will actually take it from the top.
Okay,
Thank you
Claudia.
so much, Paul. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be co-presenting with Rebecca some highlights from a report that we released last week, which is called Emergency Rental Assistance During the Pandemic, Implications for the Design of Permanent ERA Programs. And we'll definitely drop the link in the chat. This report is the result of just wonderful and a very fruitful partnership between HIP and Nlhc to repeatedly survey ERA programs across the country. And to date, we've conducted 4 survey waves with program administrators, and with this 4th and likely final wave, we really wanted to focus on what has been learned over the course of these programs' lives and what that means for policy to stabilize renters going forward, even beyond the pandemic. I've seen some very relevant questions in the chat, so I know this is an area of concern. Next slide. As you all know, this is just a very critical moment, a moment when the funding for ERA is running out and we're actually seeing some programs no longer accepting applicants. We're really at risk of losing all the knowledge and the infrastructure that's been developed over the past 2 years. And at the same time, millions of households are still struggling to pay rent. And we know that a return to the pre-pandemic status quo is just not acceptable. So we're at this kind of crossroads, and we have an opportunity to build on what we've learned to continue to protect renters against unexpected financial crises, both on the national scale, like the pandemic, and on the individual scale, like any sudden loss of income. Next slide. So before we jump into the research, let me just take a quick moment to tell you about our data and methods in this report. It's important to know that our 4 surveys don't necessarily capture the exact same set of programs because programs have been created or restructured over the course of the pandemic, and because all administrators haven't always responded to each survey. So in this particular report, we look at change over time in 4 different ways. We compare the full sample of respondents to our first survey to the full sample from our most recent survey. We also look at a small subset of 28 programs that filled out both those surveys to understand how individual programs might have evolved. We also use questions that we asked specifically in the final survey to understand adjustments related to the transition between 2 federal funding streams for these programs, ERA1 and ERA2. And finally, we use an open-ended retrospective question in that last survey to understand what program administrators wish they could have changed, knowing what they now know. Next slide. So first, what have we learned about the challenges that ERA programs face? Next. Our first important finding is that actually less than half of program administrators felt that the challenges that their program faces actually decreased over the course of 2021. So 17% felt that the challenges had remained constant or kind of fluctuated up and down, and more than a third felt that they had increased over time. So it seems very probable that future ERA efforts could learn a lot from these challenges and from these programs. Next slide. So what are the specific challenges? One very important recurring challenge is staff capacity. More than half of administrators still say this is a challenge as of late 2021. Another common challenge is technology, although that seems like something that more and more administrators feel that they have successfully addressed. A major and increasing challenge is tenant responsiveness. So that's the difficulty in engaging tenants and getting them to submit the required application materials. The same goes for landlord responsiveness, which is a crucial challenge given that most ERA programs still prefer to pay the assistance to the tenant's landlord. And finally, unclear and shifting federal guidance for ERA has come up again and again in our surveys. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to share some of the ways that these programs have addressed challenges and what we can learn from that.
Thanks, Claudia. Next slide, please. Next slide. In earlier research, we found that partnering with nonprofits was associated with lower capacity limitations. Generally, between our first survey in 2020 and our last survey in late 2021, we saw more programs work with nonprofits, both as a trend between the first and last survey, as well as among the programs that we tracked between these two periods. In retrospect, administrators wished they'd partnered sooner or structured their partnership with nonprofits differently, like including more partners, delegating more responsibility, or coordinating better. Several administrators reported that they would have made different decisions around staffing in retrospect, and a quarter of program admins would have also invested in better technology from the start. Next slide, please. Some administrators sought to improve access to their programs by introducing greater flexibility in their documentation requirements, especially by adopting self-attestation as an alternative to traditional source documentation, or by using categorical eligibility or fact-specific proxies as additional alternatives to verifying income. To become more accessible, programs also broadened their definitions of COVID-19 related hardship and reduced eligibility requirements overall. Programs also increased outreach, especially targeted, next slide, please. Programs also increased outreach, especially targeted outreach to tenants in housing court. But outreach continued to be cited as an area for improvement as of late 2021. Next slide, please. Between our first and last surveys, many programs shifted to make direct-to-tenant payments in some capacity as one way to address landlord responsiveness. And by late 2021, a majority of programs allowed direct-to-tenant payments when landlords didn't participate, and a few actually paid tenants directly without seeking landlord participation first. Program administrators fine-tuned their landlord requirements, increasing them in some respects and decreasing them in others. Of the 17 programs tracked between our first and last surveys, all but one had decreased the number of landlord requirements. Next slide, please. I think that, so in retrospect, nearly 1 in 5 administrators expressed frustration about delayed guidance on reporting requirements or found the early guidance from Treasury overly restrictive. And there were a lot of the retrospective comments reflected on that. And so given what we've learned from the pandemic emergency rental assistance programs, we have 4 important considerations for establishing permanent ERA programs. Next slide, please. First, sufficient and sustained funding is important for building adequate infrastructure and capacity. A permanent program with sustained funding would preserve the program infrastructure created by temporary ERA programs and give administrators the opportunity to make longer-term improvements in staffing, technology, and staff training. Second, flexibility in eligibility and documentation requirements, as well as targeted outreach, are important for program accessibility. Incomplete applications and obtaining documents have posed persistent challenges for ERA programs, which greater flexibility and outreach may help solve. Direct-to-tenant assistance can also improve program accessibility. Providing assistance directly to tenants ensures that qualified tenants aren't denied aid simply because their landlord does not engage with the ERA program. And lastly, clear and timely guidance and program parameters can increase administrators' certainty in making decisions on infrastructure, capacity, and program design. Shifting guidance really forced administrators to frequently revise program design and implementation, which increased administrative burdens and slowed the dispersal of funds. These pandemic ERA programs have provided a really crucial support for renters experiencing housing instability during the pandemic, but these programs are temporary, and as Claudia mentioned at the top of the presentation, they are in some places coming to a close, running out of funds. There is a clear need to make ERA a more permanent part of our housing safety net, and several current proposals, including the Eviction Crisis Act, respond to this need, and any proposal for permanent ERA should really consider these four considerations. And next slide. If you'd like to, oh no, okay. There's the disappeared slide. Next slide, please. If you'd like to read more, you'll find the link in the chat that Elena shared earlier, and also in the presentation when it's shared with you all afterwards. Thank you all for your attention, and I'll turn it back to Paul.
All right, there's the missing slide. That was good. Okay, just really quickly, there's a question here. Are there any additional resources for other nonprofits that have been involved unofficially in assisting with applications, with emergency rental assistance applications? So I assume they're asking because they'd like to learn more about, how to do that. Do we have any information that you could share, Rebecca, about how nonprofits are assisting?
Yeah, I think that there are, a lot of our reports have talked about how nonprofits have been assisting in ERA programs and the different kinds of roles that they've taken up. You'll actually see a little bit more detail in this report. Actually in the report, it was really too dense to incorporate, but we touch on it in most, if not all of our reports. And then I'd also recommend that folks look at the Nlhc Emergency Rental Assistance Resource Hub. There are a lot of really great resources there that may help to address this to some capacity.
Great. Thank you very much, Rebecca, and to Claudia for this presentation, for the outstanding research that you're sharing with us today. We really appreciate the partnership with the Housing Initiative at Penn, and we'll continue to partner with you guys. You do such great work, and so does our research team. So thank you very, very much for joining us and sharing this information today. And we will move on in our agenda. Now to give us a brief overview of the latest emergency rental assistance spending numbers through January from Treasury is Sophie Sybach-Glover from Nlhc. Sophie, take it away.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, those of you who were on the call last week might be a bit surprised that we have another Treasury spending update, but Treasury released January spending data last week. So I'll briefly go over some trends based off of what we're seeing in the new data. You can go to the next slide. I'll be sure to drop a link to the data at the end of my update. Just to let you know, due to time, I'm going to skip a few slides, but I encourage those who are interested to look at them when they're sent out, and feel free to reach out with any questions. Next slide. Between January 2021 and January 2022, $20.5 billion from ERA 1 and ERA 2 was dispersed to households, and over 4.3 million payments were made. In January 2022, grantees dispersed $763 million in ERA 1 funds, which brings the total ERA 1 spent to $15.6 billion. This is about 63% of ERA 1 funds available. Grantees dispersed about $1.2 billion of ERA 2 funds in January, which brings the total ERA 2 spent to $4.88 billion, or 23% of ERA 2 funds available. Next slide. And one more. Thank you. January spending data reveal a continued unevenness in spending performance. According to Treasury spending data for state grantees, California, Virginia, New Jersey, and North Carolina spent more than 90% of their ERA1 funds by the end of January. Because grantees are allowed to spend 10% of their ERA1 allocation on administrative expenses, this is indicative that these grantees have nearly exhausted their ERA1 allocation. Next slide. However, Treasury is currently in the process of reallocating funds from slower spending grantees to grantees that have spent their funds quickly and have remaining need. Two of these grantees, California and New Jersey, received reallocated funds in the first round. If we take that additional funding into consideration, the percent of ERA1 funds spent by California decreases by 3 percentage points, and the percent spent by New Jersey decreases by 10 percentage points. This shows that reallocated funds can be essential for programs that are close to exhausting their ERA1. Next slide. All of these state grantees have spent over 25% of their ERA2 funds. New Jersey and North Carolina have spent over 50% of their ERA2 funds, with New Jersey spending 82% and North Carolina spending 58%. Next slide. Conversely, according to Treasury monthly expenditure data, 5 state grantees have spent less than 10% of their ERA1 funds, with South Dakota reporting less than 5% of their allocation dispersed. Next slide. All of these state grantees had funds recaptured by Treasury or voluntarily reallocated a portion of their funds in the first round of reallocation. Considering this, several of these state grantees have spent a higher proportion of their ERA1 funds at their disposal than what is reflected in Treasury data. So for example, North Dakota, which voluntarily reallocated $149 million of their ERA1 allocation, has spent 23% of their ERA1 considering this adjustment. However, there still remains a large discrepancy between state grantees' expenditure rates. Next slide. And one more. Thank you. Treasury is expected to base the third round of ERA1 reallocation on January spending data. Treasury released data on the first round of reallocation in January and is expected to release data on the second round of reallocation soon. The final round of ERA1 reallocation is expected to be based on March data. When Treasury releases data on the second round of reallocation, we will be sure to provide an update. Next slide. For those interested in additional ERA resources, Nlhc tracks ERA spending through the ERA spending tracker and dashboard. Our tracking integrates Treasury data with real-time data from program dashboards and program administrators to provide a closer estimate of how much ERA funding has been obligated to date. I think my colleague dropped links to these resources in the chat. And as always, if you have any questions regarding ERA, please don't hesitate to reach out at research@nlhc.org. Back to you, Paul.
Great, Sophie, thank you so much for that update. There are a couple of questions that came in, but it looks like Kim is answering those by typing the answers into them. So I think we're good to go. Thank you very, very much for that information. We will now transition to our field updates. And we will start with Robin Powell, New Mexico Mortgage Finance Authority, Research and Development Manager. Robin?
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak and to provide an update on the New Mexico Housing Trust Fund and to highlight the recent success that we had at our legislative session. My name is Robin Powell, and I am a Research and Development Manager here at MFA. So Senate Bill 134 was passed at the recent legislative session and was signed into law on March 3rd. And the bill provides for a severance tax bond allocation to be directed toward the New Mexico Housing Trust Fund. So for a little bit of history, the New Mexico Housing Trust Fund was created in 2005 and was originally funded with $10 million. MFA is the administering agency of the trust fund. However, we are not a state agency. MFA operates under statute to administer affordable housing programs here in New Mexico. And originally, the Trust Fund Act was very capital and very specific about the uses for creating affordable housing units. It required, sticks and bricks and funding for multifamily and single family affordable housing. Last year, we amended the act to make it broader so that we could use the fund for other programs such as housing stability assistance, down payment assistance, and housing counseling. Between 2006 and early 2021, or about 16 years, the fund received an additional $17 million through the legislative allocation process. So averaged just about $1 million per year. And in some years, no funds were allocated to the trust fund at all. Despite very minimal funding, MFA was able to average a 26-to-1 return on investment, which was leveraged through equity. However, without a secure funding stream, it was very difficult to plan to meet the needs for affordable rental and homeownership in New Mexico. So last year, MFA began working with our Legislative Oversight Committee on a new avenue to fund the New Mexico Housing Trust Fund through severance tax bonds. Severance tax bonds are issued for capital outlay from funds collected through severance tax on oil and gas or other natural resources. The majority of the bonding revenue goes to fund public schools, and there were 3 other earmarks in place as of last year. During the legislative session this year, MFA secured reoccurring funding earmark of 2.5% from the severance tax bond capacity, resulting in a projected $25 to $30 million per year for the next 5 years. And future allocations will vary based mostly on New Mexico oil and gas revenues. So there were several key factors to our success with this legislation. First of all, the bill did receive bipartisan support. There were many legislators who testified on behalf of and openly supported the bill. The bill received wide support from housing advocates, affordable housing developers, home builders, commercial developers, service providers, nonprofit partners, veteran groups, tribal entities, and academia. We had a very passionate and strong advocate in Senator Nancy Rodriguez, who sponsored the legislation. Senator Rodriguez is the vice chair of the MFA Oversight Committee and vice chair of the Senate Finance Committee, which put her in a unique position to gather support. Her efforts and experience were key to getting the bill through the committee process, and she was able to shepherd the bill all the way through the session. And she's been a tireless advocate for housing and for MFA through the years. Some other factors to the success of the legislation include that there was a lot of money available this year due to high oil and gas prices. So this diluted the sense that MFA was taking resources away from other priorities. MFA staff, including our executive director, Isidoro Hernandez, and our senior director of policy and planning, Rebecca Velarde, along with our lobbyist, John Anderson, spent almost the entire session at the Capitol speaking to each and every legislator to try to garner their support. Staff patiently addressed all concerns in the committee meetings and showed great expertise in explaining how funds are optimized through leveraging. The bill also had the support of our governor, and MFA maintains a good relationship with her and her office. Another key factor was that MFA was able to provide data supporting our cause, because we've just commissioned a statewide housing strategy, which underscores the needs in New Mexico. So we were able to use the report to point to specific areas and issues in those areas, which really hits home to legislators. And another factor to that success was that housing and affordable housing have been in the media a lot lately, so legislators are hearing about these issues from their constituents. We also had support and buy-in from the State Board of Finance, which oversees the tax-exempt bond cap and the sale of severance tax bonds. Their bond counsel had vetted these intended uses and was supportive of this earmark. So all these things combined really help the stars align and for us to get the bill through. So now we have a great opportunity in front of us to plan and utilize this money and this great resource. We'll begin receiving funding in 2024, and we have about 3 years to encumber the funds, or it would be sent back into the State Board of Finance. So right now we're in a planning phase. We're looking at the more than 30 programs that MFA administers, closing any funding gaps and identifying any outstanding needs, evaluating new programs and emerging programs, and getting ready to lay out those plans in about a year to the State Board of Finance. So thank you again for the opportunity to share, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Robin, and congratulations on the legislative victory, especially getting bipartisan support for the package. Really phenomenal. I just do want to emphasize one of the things you emphasized, which is getting media coverage of the state of affordable housing is just so important. So anything the advocates can do to reach out to their local media, state media, and get coverage about the challenges people are facing right now, and the challenges are immense. We do have a question from Jerry Pohe, asking if you have a report describing the pursuit of the severance tax bond funding, leveraging funding impacts, et cetera.
We do not have anything formal at this time, but I do think that this was getting a lot of attention throughout the affordable housing world. So that may be something that we can develop and can share.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Robin, for this report and for all your great work.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on now to our next presenter for a field update, Brad Hearn, lead organizer from Human Rights Committee of San Francisco. Brad, take it away.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you for having me on today to talk about the legislation that we just passed in San Francisco. My name is Brad Hearn. I work at Housing Rights Committee of San Francisco, a tenants' rights organization in the city. And I can go to the next slide here. So I'm here to discuss local legislation that our Board of Supervisors recently passed, and that will be taking effect on April 11th of this year. We call this the Right to Organize legislation. We also refer to it as a union at home. And the legislation, as far as we know, the first of its kind in the country, creates a new framework for collective bargaining between tenant associations and their landlords. This was inspired by some work that we've been doing in SF, but also it's intended to level the playing field in negotiations that occur often between tenants and their landlords. And what this legislation does is it creates new rights and protections for tenants who choose to organize in their buildings. And then when they do organize and certify the association through this ordinance, then the landlord has new obligations to meet and confer with the tenant association. And we can go to the next slide, please. In San Francisco, many of the rights that tenants currently have are considered housing services. So this includes like heat, plumbing, etc. So what we've done in this ordinance is classified organizing activities as housing services. This means that doing flyering, door knocking in a building, inviting a non-resident advocate into the building, holding meetings in common areas, and actually meeting with the landlord are all considered housing services like plumbing would be. In this ordinance, again, all of these new rights and obligations are triggered only when tenants choose to actually organize an association using the ordinance. That's triggered at a 50% plus one threshold of occupied units that sign a petition and submit it to the landlord. The landlord can contest the petition if they choose to, or accept it, and then the tenant association would have the obligation to send out a request to meet and begin dialogue on issues of common concern. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay. In San Francisco, there has been a right to, we've had a local ordinance that extends a very limited right to flyer buildings. And in California, there is a limited right to invite non-resident advocates into a building. But we've seen over the last few years a lot of disputes about the interpretation of that law, particularly by larger corporate landlords who have continued to consolidate in the city and in California. So this extends these organizing rights and classifies them as housing services, and also says that interfering with these activities would be a reduction in housing services, which sets up a remedy for the tenant association outside of civil court or litigation. So part of the inspiration for this is also to reduce the burden on civil court and open up a line of communication, open up a remedy that would be done directly through negotiation between the two parties or facilitated by our local rent board. Go to the next slide, please. So when the association requests a meeting with the landlord, and if the landlord refuses to meet or interrupts door knocking or takes down flyers that have been posted or something like that, the association can file what in SF we call a multi-unit petition at the San Francisco Rent Board. And this is for a reduction in housing. This would be a reduction in housing services. So the petition would go to a mediation first that's facilitated by an administrative law judge. And then if it isn't resolved in mediation, it would go to arbitration. But the remedy is rent reductions potentially. And these processes at the local rent board are typically much faster and more timely than civil court litigation. So again, this is designed to open up a remedy that is outside of the courts. And next slide, please. Oh, that's it. So I'll put my email in the chat again, and I'll post a news article as well. And thank you again for your time today.
Thank you so much, Brad. What a phenomenal achievement. Had a great overview of it. We did have requests for copies of the ordinance and or a website, and we Elena on our team did share a link to the ordinance. So I think we're good to go there. One quick question here is there a threshold below which the law does not apply? Is there?
Yes. So
go ahead.
Yes, the exemptions in the ordinance right now are buildings that are run by nonprofit supportive housing. Those are not covered in the ordinance. And then the unit threshold is 5 units or more in a multifamily building are covered. And so anything less than 5 units is not covered. That's for private multifamily buildings.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us, Brad, and congratulations on this win. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
All right, we will move on now to our final field update, and that is from Kim McCarthy, Executive Director of Community Alliance of Tenants in Oregon. Kim, take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Just give me a moment. So good afternoon. I'm Kim McCarty, Executive Director for the Community Alliance of Tenants. The Community Alliance of Tenants is a statewide organization here in Oregon, and our mission is to educate and empower tenants to demand safe, stable, and affordable rental homes We believe that housing is the basis of a strong community, so we bring tenants together to organize and collectively advocate for fair and equal protections in housing practices and policies. So I'm here this afternoon to talk about some of the organizing work of our members. As we've been, many of you have been talking about here today about emergency rental assistance and the impacts of COVID and what all of our communities have been doing to keep housing stable. Our members realized that in Oregon, although we did really well as a state in spending down the ERA funds, we didn't get any new allocation when the funds were reallocated. So when our legislature met recently to talk about the future, a lot of the talk was the pandemic is over. We need to move on to building more affordable housing. We need to move on to addressing more long-term issues. And our members, primarily low-income tenants, were saying, no, there's still a problem. Many of us were sick just 2 weeks ago. Many of us still had children that were ill, couldn't work. We've still have been losing income. We still can't pay our rent. And so with those really still very emergency types of issues on the table, we came to the legislature and said, you need to have some additional emergency resources here. And it appears to us, because there aren't any more federal funds, that you need to allocate those from your own state funds. So we asked for $100 million. We asked for that much, in part because we estimate there's about 10 to 20,000 households statewide that still hadn't applied for funds that we feel very confident were needing those resources. And in Oregon, it's been about $7,000 to $9,000 per household in back rent that has been needed. The current system that's in place is very onerous in terms of the qualifications, how you find out, and our most vulnerable residents here in Oregon, someone who doesn't speak English, who might be a person of color, who's especially low income or disabled, our most vulnerable folks were not getting the best access to that system. Not everyone was using an attestation style of application. So we really wanted these resources from the state to get out into the community as low barrier as possible, not utilizing the same kinds of application that was required with the federal funds. And then that they would also be distributed through our culturally specific organizations and organizations where people have a lot of trust and knowledge and how to reach those resources. So we feel very fortunate that in this year, our governor made a proposal for $400 million in housing resources generally, which was really quite unprecedented. And out of that, they carved out $80 million specifically for what they call the homelessness prevention package and housing stability package, which will address homelessness issues, but also gives flexibilities to communities to have their own rent assistance programs. And then I'll just say just a little bit more that it wouldn't have been possible without it being a coalition. We had over 30 organizations that signed on to this idea. And it really also stemmed from some of the work that coalitions had started earlier when all of this federal money was pouring into the state and our communities were saying, hey, we really need to have a more democratic system for figuring out how to allocate those funds. And so with that type of conversation that happened over a year ago when those first federal funds came in, we were able to have that conversation again, and people understood why it was really important to listen to community and their identified needs. And then I'll just end with a little bit about what we have learned this year. With our particular Oregon Emergency Rental Assistance Program ends today. So about somewhere between about $189 million have been distributed to date, as I understand, about over 500 million since the beginning of the pandemic. 40,000 Oregon households have been served. And as I said earlier, CAT, the Community Alliance of Tenants, predicted that actually we needed to serve about 90,000 households, because those are the folks that have been telling us that they were fearful about their ability to pay rent. And we also are transitioning with many of our organizations here in Oregon to be concerned about homelessness, because while these resources have staved off widespread evictions, we still see the signs of homelessness. We still see that it's increasing. A recent survey here in our metro area showed that a third of our residents in the metro Oregon, Portland area feel that they're on the brink of homelessness, and over half know somebody who has been homeless. And I'll just end by saying that we, there's just so much of homelessness that we can't count, because in our particular legal system, there isn't any particular way to know who has gotten an eviction notice. So we are very confident that many people have just left with that very first notice, or they just know that they can't pay $10,000, so they've left their housing. So we have a lot of people that are doubled up. And we're really looking for some of these long-term solutions that I've heard today, like a long-term emergency rental assistance program that anticipates future public health emergencies or a fire emergency, as we had here in Oregon, because our state agencies just couldn't, you just can't ramp up for something like this overnight. It really needs to be a structure that's in place right now. So thank you very much for this time today.
Thank you, Kim, and congratulations to you and the coalition that worked together really powerfully to achieve what you achieved. There's one question here from Andrew Height, just asking, have many of your households exceeded 18 months of needing emergency rental assistance?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know. I do know that most households, we advise them to seek the full amount of what we understand to be 15 months of housing assistance. So 12 months in the past and at least 3 months into the future. As I understand it right now, I don't think Oregon is even helping people with future rent. I think they're only have enough money to help people with their past COVID related rent.
Right. Okay, thank you so much. And you're seeing, terrific work. Congrats on great organizing. Just want to echo that. Really phenomenal job. And thank you so much for joining us today to share this progress you've made.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to just close now. But again, I just want to urge everyone to please join us for the Housing Policy Forum on March 22nd, 23rd. A couple minutes ago, I put the link again into the chat. So please register for that. And then also remember, there's a free webinar on Wednesday, March 16th about Nlhc policy priorities. And we urge you to join us for that. It'll go over Nlhc's key policy priorities for our Capitol Hill Day, which will take place on March 24th, our virtual Capitol Hill Day. We urge all of you to join in that. Reach out to your members of Congress. We are putting teams together so you can reach out to folks here at the coalition to join others in your state and jurisdictions to reach out to your members of Congress. And just another reminder that our next House call will not be next week. It'll be the following week, March 28th. And then after that, the following Monday, April 4th, we will have our first Our Homes, Our Votes nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement webinar, providing you training and tools and resources on how to do effective voter registration, voter mobilization, all in a way that nonprofits can do that work and to engage candidates in appropriate ways as well on affordable housing. So want to urge you to keep your eye open for announcements from the coalition about those Our Homes, Our Votes webinars, which start on April 4th. Thank you everybody for participating, all the participants listening in, and especially to our panelists and speakers. Thank you so much. You guys are all fantastic. And we will see you hopefully at the Policy Forum next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.